the Salvation Army. William Booth had been through many varieties of Methodist before he started out on his own. He'd preached for the Wesleyans, the Wesleyan Reformers, and something called the New Connection, who ordained him in 1858. But he wanted to go and preach where the people were, rather than where his circuit sent him, and so he became an irregular itinerant preacher. Methodism, which had started with people who could not be constrained by the established church, was now unable to constrain a new variety of preacher. In 1865, William and Catherine Booth set up a Christian mission in a tent in Whitechapel. This grew into the Salvation Army, much to the irritation of the churchmen. They thought the new movement made Christianity look ridiculous. Some took direct action, damaging buildings and assaulting Salvation Army officers. And it's possible they were encouraged by brewers who opposed the army's teetotalism. Salvation Army was primarily concerned with the spiritual condition rather than the material condition of the masses. If their hearts changed, this would be the best change in their condition. As we know, over time, they moved more into being a part of a social response. Booth himself was an authoritarian, and in 1877, when he was in full control of the mission, he developed its military emphasis with uniforms, with corps having citadels, and with a magazine called The War Cry. Now this gave every member a dignity as a soldier. And this was attractive to some of the people who were part of the working class. He also understood the principles of mass communication and religious advertisement. In time, Booth was influenced by his friend Congregationalist J.B. Patton to consider social issues, and so became the Army's emphasis on social action. Evangelism and social work were seen as two sides of the same coin. The aim of both was the total redemption of human beings. I wonder if you have noticed quite how close some Congregational churches and some Church of England churches are. On the slide I've put a map of Twyford in Berkshire, and you'll see there they're right next door to each other. During the 19th century, a rift continued between the Church of England and those who weren't attracted to it, and dissenters' chapels grew. This was partly a matter of class, but there were also irritants for nonconformists. Nonconformists had been tolerated under William and Mary, but the church still had control of the universities and the church schools, about which I'll talk briefly later. As the century went on, also the church was slow to respond to urbanisation, and so chapels flourished in the new cities. By the end of the century, the various groups that were termed chapel had sprung up, and there were both original dissenters and new groups that had come along. They were more confident and were looking for equal rights with the Church of England in what was now a pluralist society and was increasing secularising. And originally this word pluralism doesn't refer to different religions, but different sorts of Christian. Chapels threw up some great preachers such as Charles Spurgeon, who was converted while listening to a primitive Methodist preacher. He was baptised, and by the time he was 20 was the Baptist pastor at New Park Street Chapel in Southwark. He was a very direct preacher. His style bordered on irreverence. While his chapel was being extended, he had services at the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, to the scandal of some. From 1861 to 1891 he preached at the specially erected Metropolitan Tabernacle, which seated 600. And he set up a pastor's college, Spurgeon's College, which during his lifetime trained 900 men. He was an independent Baptist because he was a Calvinist. Another thing that occurred through the 19th century was the founding of the National Society. In October 1811, there was a founding meeting and a statement about educational purpose was recorded, that the national religion should be made the foundation of national education and should be the first and chief thing taught to the poor, according to the excellent liturgy and catechism provided by our church. The Society published books, provided equipment for the training of teachers. It was also had a mission to found a church school in every parish in England and Wales. It offered grants to prospective founders on condition the development was fostered on chosen lines. The Society funded construction, enlarging and fitting up of schoolrooms. It was involved with the foundation of the majority of the Church of England Church and Wales schools, which were originally known as national schools. This movement led to over 25% of the schools in this country being church schools. It was alongside another movement of the British and foreign schools, which set up British schools, but those were set up by dissenters. Of course, all this was well before the movement to have state paid for education. The oldest schools are church schools. The ecclesiastical commissioners were founded in this period too. Before the Norman Conquest, the clergy of the Church of England received an income from their living. Tax on that income was paid to the Pope, and after the break with Rome in 1530s, to the Crown instead. That was all very well, while all the parishes were rural and while the land was the main source of wealth. But once you started having urbanisation, how are you going to respond to that? So in 1818, the Church Building Commissioners were set up by Parliament to create new parishes, provide new churches. And then in 1836, Parliament set up the Ecclesiastical Commissioners to reorganise dioceses. They also abolished what they saw as surplus posts in cathedrals and took over the money so they could fund bishops. They've made sure you funded a dean and 2 posts in cathedrals, but there was surplus money there, which could be used for the cure of souls in parishes where assistance was most required. In 1856, they took over from the Church Building Commissioners, and from 1907 they became involved with clergy pensions. Also in this period we have the movement away from tithes being paid in corn to the corn rent, which is an amount of money that you had to pay based on what it was determined your field would produce. And so we have tithe maps drawn up at this time. Eventually, in the 20th century, these corn rents were ended and a certain sum of money given to the church commissioners in lieu of that. So that's where church commissioners' money comes from. It's both historic assets of bishoprics and of cathedrals and the money that was paid over in the early part of the 20th century to buy out from tithes. 19th century was a key time for mission. Up until the 19th century, mission was almost an add-on as empires were being formed. And so, as America was settled, people went over there to make sure that the Europeans in America were looked after. And it was a bit of a second thought that then maybe you could talk about Christianity to those who were already there. In the 19th century, there was a spirit of exploration and adventure. Now, Europeans knew little about the interior of Africa and Asia and wanted to know more. Now, we have to accept that there were some strange ideas at this point. The idea that because Europeans didn't know about the interior, everything there was entirely uncivilised. Of course, civilization meaning centred around towns, and uncivilised meant not worthwhile. So we have to be honest that the Europeans wanted to take their understanding of how to live a good life into Africa and Asia. The Roman Catholics were best at getting on with this task. Protestants took a bit longer to take on the idea. And in the Church of England we had the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, but that had been mainly concerned with the English overseas. But with the American awakening in the 18th century, there was this vision of the world filled with God's glory, a return to the Bible. And in the Bible, Jesus said to take news of him to all nations. So missionary societies were formed to do exactly that. The first denomination to really get active were the Moravians, who were willing to go to great length in their mission. They were a Protestant group who were formed in Eastern Europe out of the Reformation. They went to the extent of getting sold into slavery in the West Indies to reach those who'd been enslaved. And as you've heard, the Wesley brothers were profoundly affected by Moravians they met as they were going over to America. The idea of Britain as a Christian nation with Christian responsibilities overseas took root in the 19th century. Bishoprics were established in India and elsewhere, and the Society of Propagation of the Gospel finally worked out that they could take the gospel to people who weren't British overseas. Anglo-Catholics caught this vision too, and even a small liberal missionary movement developed in the early 20th century. But the first missionaries to places like India weren't Anglicans. You see, the traders were unwilling to support such mission for fear that it would upset the Hindus and the Muslims and so harm British trade. But when the Baptist William Carey went to India as a missionary in 1794, he was resisted by the Anglicans. But he stayed, his work grew, he set up mission stations, and he supervised the translation of the Bible into local languages. When the British moved further into Africa, all denominations went too, and so we got a patchwork of different countries being more affected by different denominations. Now, much of this mission aimed to make the local church self-sustaining and so educated local leaders. And actually, in time, this often led to nationalist movements. Once slavery had been abolished, traders looked for another way of making money, and so started to look for raw materials in Africa. So we get the expeditions into Africa, not just about exploration for its own sake, but to find raw materials. Some of these expeditions led to little results, but now the mission societies had the bit between their teeth. The Church Mission Society had a Niger expedition in 1841 which failed, but it wanted to take the gospel to the Yoruba people. As they did, they also took cotton growing, and the Yoruba found this more profitable than the slave trade, so it was a way of undermining the push for the slave trade there. David Livingstone also sought to halt the East African slave trade run by Arabs and Swahili people by attracting locals to alternative, more profitable commerce. He felt that Christianity, commerce and civilization went together. Slaves in the West Indies were also evangelised, much to the chagrin of their masters who felt that they were more obedient without Christianity. The slaves who accepted the faith found in it a dignity they wanted, but they also wanted freedom. From this period we get the Negro spirituals, excuse my using that term, but that's what they were called. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming to Carry Me Home was a song of freedom longing by those who were enslaved. The leaders of the slave revolts in Jamaica in 1831-32 were Jamaican Baptists. The Church Mission Society, wanting to evangelise West Africa, came up with an interesting idea. The Clapham set that you saw pictures of earlier founded Sierra Leone as a colony with resettled slaves. Now these came there as Christians and were encouraged to be Africa's evangelists. One such Africa leader was Samuel Crowther. When he was baptised, he chose to take that English name, which was the name of the vicar who had baptised him. He was a Yoruba. He was captured at the age of 15, but his ship was intercepted and was taken to Sierra Leone. There he became a Christian and took that English name, and was trained by CMS and pioneered Yoruba language services in Freetown. He then returned to his people in Nigeria and successfully led the Niger mission. He had an all-African staff working over hundreds of miles. And it is perhaps because of this that your average Anglican today is a Nigerian. Finally, a brief thought about Darwin, the Church and science. As I said earlier, one of the outflows of the Enlightenment was the growing use of the scientific method. Many of the scientists were parsons. They had a comfortable living. It gave them time to be scholars. Darwin, however, is the one who published about evolution. It wasn't a new idea. It'd been suggested by ancient Greek philosophers. But the discoveries of the 19th century set it on evidential grounding. We had Lyell's Principles of Geology published in the 1830s, arguing the present state of the Earth had been brought about by long gradual development. In 1844, Robert Chambers published anonymously The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which suggested that this same long slow process had happened to animals. It was Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859 which gave the ideas the backing they needed. For some Christians, these new ideas were a jolt, because if you look literally at the beginning of Genesis, the earth was created in 6 days. Darwin said it had taken longer. There was a meeting of the British Association in Oxford, and Samuel Wilberforce, who was then the Bishop of Oxford and was ridiculed as Soapy Sam, ridiculed the ideas. His opponent, T.H. Huxley, took the role of humble scientist, and over the next years he steered these ideas into scientific orthodoxy. And it's Huxley who coins the term agnostic for those who just don't know whether there's a God or not. Now, some people took the ideas of evolution and used them for their own ends, from Marx using them to justify communism, to J.D. Rockefeller using them to justify the growth of big business. Some Christian preachers denounced these ideas, so for example Spurgeon denounced them, but others, including Frederick Temple, were more cautious. These ideas led some to review Genesis 1 and see it as a symbolic poetic piece rather than a literal account. And it's worth noting that not all the original authors of the fundamentals were creationists.